Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Namaste. We are about to start. My name is Mashudubele Mamabolo, Counsellor, Political at the South African High Commission. So I'll be the master of ceremony for this event this evening. We will first start with the school children who will come and do a performance for us. 2 items, and then they'll leave. And then we will start with our program. Please, young people, come to the stage.
Go ahead. You block us, there's no problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Let me just try. Go ahead.
Wow, wow, what an excellent and magnificent pieces that you performed for us. Especially the struggle song that you sing in a Zulu language, one of the 11 languages in South Africa. It was touching. It was about Mandela and the struggle, people urging him to stand up and lead them in the struggle towards liberation of South Africa. Thank you very much for that important item. Now I will do the introduction. So after the introduction, Professor, I want to give an award, not award, but a gift to the speaker. Okay. Or should I? Okay, we can do the thing. Dr. Borker, Professor Chanduhoke, Professor Ambassador Sooklal, who is joining us from KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. We wish to welcome you to the 2024 edition of the prestigious annual lecture hosted by the IIC and the South African High Commission in Delhi. Welcoming everybody as well. This year, Nelson Mandela International Day, which is on the 18th July, will be celebrated under the theme, "It is still in our hands to combat poverty and inequality." Nelson Mandela, in addressing the scourge of poverty, he said the following words: "Like slavery and apartheid. Poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Indeed, these inspirational words by the former President Nelson Mandela are a stark reminder that we must do more to fight the scourge of poverty and inequality. This year, we mark Nelson Mandela Day as our country's ushers in the 7th Democratic Administration, following the successful conclusion of the 2024 national and provincial elections. This presents an opportunity to realign our collective energies to build the country we envision at the start of democracy, which includes taking care of the most vulnerable in our midst and providing hope for a better tomorrow. This day is an opportunity for citizens to recognize their individual power to change the world for better. We can also play a part by raising awareness and expanding the reach of Mandela's values, including the fight against injustice, helping people in need, and advancing reconciliation. Through our actions, we can help build our nation by helping one person at a time. Every action we take has a knock-on effect, which will soon snowball into advancing our nation. It is through this united front that we can build stronger communities and stronger societies. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, who is none other than Professor Dr. Suhas Borker. He has a very wide, long biography. So I'll just really summarize it. He founded Citizen First TV in 1981, documentary film making since 1980. That was 44 years ago. Founded 3 voluntary civil society initiatives in early 1990s, which continues to actively work today on policy alternatives for an equitable development paradigm, working group on alternative strategies, advocacy of public service broadcasting, environmental protection, Green Cycle of Delhi, 1992. He's a regular speaker. He moderates, he chairs discussions, seminars on issues of governance, media, economy, environment, and inclusive policy. His connection with South Africa. Having been inducted in 1987 as a supporter of anti-apartheid movement in South Africa at the International Media Conference in support of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, New Delhi. Organized by NAM Media, NA Media, under the leadership of the veteran journalist, Nikhil Chakravarti. Met David Kotsi, journalist, anti-apartheid campaigner, and founder of SouthScan. Met David Kotsi again in London later in the same year, 1987. Oh, all right. One of his documentary, Unfinished Revolution, on the history of NAM was screened by South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, on the opening of the 12th NAM Summit at Durban, which was chaired by Nelson Mandela. In 2012, he was invited by the ANC to address the plenary of the 3rd International Solidarity Conference in Pretoria. Without further ado, I would like to invite him to come to the stage.
Thank you very much, Project Director, Counsellor, Mamabolo. Madiba Tujhe Salam. His Excellency Dr. Anil Sooklal, High Commissioner, is he there? High Commissioner, can you turn on the camera, please? Yeah, there you are. Yeah. His Excellency Dr. Anil Sooklal, the High Commissioner Designate of South Africa to India, who is joining us all the way from South Africa. My friend, Professor Neera Chandok, our distinguished speaker for the 7th Mandela Lecture, Project Director, Counsellor of the South African High Commission, Mamabolo, fellow members of the IIC and the Working Group on Alternative Strategies. Today morning, in this very hall, we commemorated and celebrated Madiba's 106th birthday with music and song and an insightful interactive session with students drawn from the NCR of Delhi, 16 schools, right from Ghaziabad, Noida, Gurgaon, and of course, Delhi. The hall was chock-a-block full with students completely occupying the aisles, 300 in a hall which can take in 230. Counsellor Mamabolo said he was bowled over with the passion and enthusiasm of the youngsters. I'm sure Professor Chandok's lecture shall be an enriching experience, and we are all looking forward to it. I mean, a book which he wrote specially on the whole aspects of reconciliation, and which was published by Routledge. I mean, it's no doubt a very seminal contribution. We are happy that High Commissioner Sooklal is joining us, and we look forward to welcoming him very soon in New Delhi. Ram Manohar Lohia, our socialist leader, used to say that there are 3 kinds of Gandhians. Firstly, the Sarkari Gandhians, or the lackeys of the government. Secondly, the Mathi Gandhians, or the doctrinaire ones. Thirdly, the Kujat Gandhians, or the Sarfiras, or who would not fit in any box, who would be restless to take an alternative path, to go out of the box, strike a new way, the progressive ones. Mandela was one such Gandhian. Today morning, I told the students that there were 3 lessons from Madiba's political life which I wanted to stress on. Lesson number 1 from Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's leadership was not divisive. He did not sow hatred among his people against others, but his leadership bound people together. As he put it quite clearly, I quote, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite," unquote. Lesson number 2 from Nelson Mandela. Mandela led his country and left office being morally clean and ethically upright. We have to guard against leadership which is rife with political profiteering, swindling, material aggrandizement, filling the pockets of their cronies, and looting the meager national cake. Lesson number 3 from Nelson Mandela. In his book, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela wrote, I quote, "I never lose, I win or I learn." That symbolized Madiba's life. I told the youngsters who were present in this hall in the morning, the next time something challenging happens to you, whether you are in the sports field, running a race, playing cricket, or playing hockey, writing an examination, debating, or on the elocution platform, in anything, you can either let it pull you down, or you can think that this is something you learn from. Next time something challenging happens, you will be emerging from it stronger. Consider the challenge as a gift. If we don't experience any difficulties in our life, we will not grow. These are some lessons we have to learn from Madiba for us in India. Madiba, tujhe salam. I thank you.
Wow, what a profound message, Dr. Borker. 3 lessons that we can learn from Mandela. And also lessons that we can learn from Gandhi, because Gandhi influenced Mandela. When he was in prison, he devoured the works of Gandhi. That's why when he emerged out of prison, he becomes a man of nonviolence. I think that is deep. It is a great pleasure to now introduce our main speaker of the day, none other than Professor Borker. She's a distinguished fellow at the Center of the Equity Studies, New Delhi. Prior to this, she was a professor of political science at the University of Delhi and director of Developing Countries Research Center at the same university. She was a visiting professor at the Center of the Study of Law and Governance at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was also a National Fellow, Indian Council of Social Science Research, visiting fellow, Center of Ethics and Global Politics, Luce University in Rome. And then she was awarded Gaetano Mosca Chair, University of Turin in Turin. Apart from her seminal work on Nelson Mandela, entitled Nelson Mandela, Peace Through Reconciliation, which was published in 2021, her recent publications include We, the People, and Our Constitution. That was published in 2024. Violence in Our Bones, 2021. Rethinking Pluralism, Secularism, Tolerance, Anxiety of Coexistence, 2019. Democracy and Revolutionary Politics, 2015. And Contested Secessionists, 2012. She is a frequent contributor to print and online publications such as The Hindu, The Wire, The Indian Express, and The Tribune. You are welcome, Professor. The floor is yours.
Your Excellency, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be asked to give this lecture on Nelson Mandela, someone who I've been rather fascinated by and remembered increasingly in our days of right-wing populism, when seldom a call for unity goes out the way that Mandela did to an extremely divided South Africa when he came out of jail. Let me start by suggesting that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of socialist societies, the impact was felt most in Central and in Eastern Europe. Countries dissolved, federations melted away, and many of the states that had been newly formed out of the debris of old ones were caught up in endless cycles of ethno-nationalist conflict. A.E. Housman had written in a very different context at the end of the First World War. They say my verse is sad. No wonder its narrow measure spans tears of eternity and sorrow, not mine, but man's. This is the story of Central and Eastern Europe in the years that followed the demise of socialism and the rise of liberal triumphalism. A new question was propelled onto the agenda of political theorists. How do people who belong to different ethnic persuasions, races, castes, religions live together in a society in a degree of harmony, in a degree of civility, in a degree of tolerance? The agenda of political theory was noticeably truncated. From Plato to John Rawls, political theorists have dreamt grand dreams of well-ordered societies founded on the prime principle of justice. And there came a time in the 1990s when it was not justice, but injustice that began to preoccupy political theorists. Avishai Margalit wrote a very interesting little book called The Decent Society, in which he said, forget about justice. Let's talk about a decent society in which people do not humiliate each other on the grounds of morally arbitrary factors, such as birth in a particular gender or a race or a religion. How can we live in a society where people do not humiliate each other? Some of the debates that erupted around this question across the world were noticeably abstract and centered around the notion of dialogue. But a number of political theorists began to look at the experiment that Nelson Mandela had initiated in South Africa, the experiment of peace through reconciliation. Please note that peace through reconciliation is the diametric opposite of the law that the Nuremberg trials had carved onto the cold stone of law, that of victor's justice. Victor's justice was something that Nelson Mandela turned his back upon, and he talked about nonviolence. He talked about forgiveness. He talked about not essentializing people on the basis of their color and their race. And he talked about coming to terms with history. Now, this, it seems to me, is an extremely important fact, because we know that across the world, increasingly, in the irresponsible hands of politicians, history has become combustible. Societies have literally been burnt up by remembering the past. You know, the popular adage says, the past determines the future, but the present determines the past. So the past has been interpreted in such a way that societies are divided, not united. Politicians who divide society on the basis of history or imagine history are politicians. Politicians who imagine unity through history are statesmen. And that is where I would place Nelson Mandela along with Jawaharlal Nehru. Given the history of the inhumanity of man to man in apartheid South Africa, the evocation of history during the transitional period to majority rule could have set off bloodshed and civil war. This was what international experts were talking about and fearing. Across the world, newspapers carried the possibility of civil war in South Africa. Nelson Mandela defied them, these very preconditions. He came out of the dreaded and notorious jails of apartheid South Africa in February 1990, 11th February to be more precise, after 27 years in Robben Island, Polismore, and Victor Verster. He had been jailed in 1964 along with his colleagues in the famous Rivonia trials after the military arm of the ANC, the Umkhonto, had launched 5 attacks on power stations and government buildings. He had gone into prison in 1964 as someone who advocated violence. He came out a pacifist. In prison, he had ample time to think about the future of South Africa. The tale he wrote in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, is perfect for reflection. And there were other political prisoners that he could talk to and debate with. He came to the conclusion that the only way South Africa could get out of that mess of the withdrawal of the apartheid regime and transfer to majority rule was a negotiation with the regime and most particularly with his own people. And the only way that he could come to terms with such an eventuality was to come to terms with the brutality of the apartheid regime. Victor's justice was no solution to the problems of humankind. It leads to nothing but endless cycles of violence. The only way out is reconciliation. It was a wise decision. We cannot forget the past because if we try and do so, the past lurks under the surface of the body politic like a festering sore, which can erupt at the very touch of a hand. No country can live in peace with itself, unless it comes to terms with the past. We have to accept that terrible things were done to people by people in history. We have to say we will never do them again, instead of using history to perpetuate hate among our own people. It's very surprising, but once he came to jail, he was put in the jails, in the very notorious jails of the apartheid regime. Mandela becomes a myth. Young people did not know what he looked like because it was a crime to circulate his photograph or utter his name. His speeches prior to his incarceration were banned. His image and his name was wiped out from the public domain. Yet he came to be revered across the world. A mass movement harnessed outrage against the apartheid regime for imprisoning Mandela. Prominent intellectuals signed petitions, including Bertrand Russell and Simone de Beauvoir. Concerts in his name flew the flag of Free Mandela, and lead singers Bruce Springsteen and Miles Davis sang for him. After 27 years, Mandela entered a world that had been turned upside down by the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he faced three major setbacks or three major problems. The first was that the Soviet Union, that had been committed to the liberation war in every colonized country, had disappeared, was going to disappear. The socialist world had collapsed. This was a world leading through the rule of the free market and a liberal democracy. Even the microphone that the journalist put before him seemed strange to him. What is this ball of fur? He asked the journalist. He said, "Sir, this is a microphone." But when he walked out of prison, despite all the anonymity that had been heaped upon him, massive crowds had lined the streets right up to the city hall where he was supposed to give his address. He walked out on the balcony and he saw a boundless sea of people cheering, holding flags, and laughing. And he writes in his autobiography, "I raised my fist to the crowd and the crowd responded with enormous cheer. These cheers fired me anew with the spirit of the struggle. Amandla," I called out. Finally, when the crowd had started to settle down, I took out my speech. "Friends, comrades, and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all. I stand before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years I have at your feet." But South Africa had also changed. It was not the South Africa that he knew of when he went into jail in 1964. In 1960, Sharpeville had happened when the police fired upon 69 demonstrators. And this was the time when the world oddly began to take notice of South Africa. In June 1976, 10,000 school children marching against the imposition of Afrikaans upon them were fired upon. The police shot 100 protesters. The country was on the boil. The rising crescendo of protests since the 1970s among the Blacks, among the workers, among urban slum dwellers, contractual and ill-paid labor, and students send a strong message: no more of apartheid. Demonstrations, boycotts of rents and service charges, political strikes, stayaways, protest marches, huge gatherings at funerals and funeral orations which led to upsurges, showed up the cracks of a deeply flawed system. It also was extremely worrying because obviously the violence of the apartheid regime had been internalized, exactly as Frantz Fanon had predicted. When you have violence by the ruling class, the ruled are embedded in violence. And this was also something that Gandhi had warned against, that violence catches both in its coils, both the oppressor and the oppressed. Once we give in to the seductions of violence, we become lesser human beings. This was to trouble Mandela in the days to come. In his autobiography, Mandela wrote that conditions in South Africa were much more serious than he had imagined. The turn of the 90s was one of the most bloodiest periods in South African history. Inkatha clashed with the ANC workers in Natal, and the cycle of violence was spiraling out of control. Natal had become a killing field. He went to Durban and spoke to a 10,000 strong crowd in King's Park. He pleaded with them to lay down arms, to take each other's hands in peace. Take your guns, your knives, and your weapons and throw them into the sea. End this war now. But my call fell on deaf ears, he writes. The fighting and the dying continues. You know, I've often thought when we have these bouts of violence, for example, in Manipur, who is the man or woman in India who would stand up and say, enough, that is enough. Throw everything into the sea. We want peace. Not a single person. Not a single person will get up and say it. And that shows the difference between the leaders of the 1990s and the leaders of today, the film stars, the celebrities, the industrialists, the intellectuals. Who stands up and says, enough? There is enough violence. Put down your weapons. The impending transfer of power also, and this is the third challenge he faced enormous problems. The whites were determined to hold on to power at any cost, either by tweaking the constitution or, in extreme cases, asking for a state of their own. Passions were inflamed to the point of explosion. And in the middle of spiraling tension, Mandela brought the rare virtues of compassion, farsightedness, prudence, forgiveness, wisdom, and acceptance of all as equal citizens of an independent South Africa, of a free South Africa. His task was not easy. On many occasions, he walked alone on the long walk to freedom. He was reviled for having sold out to the whites, for going soft on the oppressors, and having let down his own people, many of whom had planned Nuremberg-like trials after the country transited to majority rule. Mandela insisted no violence, no bringing the whites to justice. The ANC is a broad church of all colors, ideology, classes, united in their fight against prejudice and apartheid. We will set up a constitutional, non-racial state. His answers in press conferences were the model of sane and rational reason. Where do we find this rational reason today in our days of right-wing populism? To drive the whites away would be an act of suicide. They have contributed so much to the country, he said. We have to appreciate them. In any case, where will they go? You can't drive people into the sea. The Afrikaans, who were the dominant class in South Africa, had lost touch with the Netherlands. They had nothing to do with their homeland. Their home was South Africa. They will live here, stated Mandela. They will be treated as equal citizens. provided they abandon apartheid. He had struggled against the domination of the whites. He did not want to struggle against the domination of the black, against Frantz Fanon. I don't know if you read Frantz Fanon, but Frantz Fanon had said, you can use violence, but as long as it is political. Otherwise, you'll have a ruling class which is embedded in violence. His policies were evidence of his generosity and his foresight. He became the president of the ANC in 1992. And after Oliver Tambo, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty is here, we will remember we had a research group in Delhi University. We called it Oliver Tambo Bhavan. In 1990, he led the negotiations with the white government in 93, 94. In 94, the ANC swept the polls. They got 60%, but he set up a government of national unity. He brought in the much reviled National Party, whom the blacks had struggled against. He even brought in Inkatha to create a coalition of people who would lead the country, not to madness, but to sanity. Under his leadership, the negotiations for a transfer of power were handled very successfully. The London Financial Times of 18th July in 1994 referred to the regime change in South Africa and one of the most extraordinary political transformations of the 20th century, where people defied the logic of the past and broke all rules of social theory. Now, witness the man's generosity. After he was elected as president, he established a multiracial cabinet. De Klerk, the previous head of state, became one of his deputy presidents. Under his leadership, he crafted a new flag, which represented all groups and spoke of unity. The national anthem, which we heard these children sing, combined a popular liberation song, God Bless Africa, with parts of the old anthem. They were not sung sequentially as they used to be. They were sung synchronically. They came up integrated into one national anthem. In a personal message of reconciliation, he invited his Afrikaner jailers to his inaugural. They were non-literate, they were unenlightened, but they were invited. He visited the prosecutor who sent him to prison. He hosted a tea party for white politicians and a dinner party for the commanders of Robben Island, which used to be a leprosy center, which was so isolated, where he was jailed. He called on the wife of the former Prime Minister of Dr. Verwoerd, who had institutionalized apartheid, as well as on the former president, B.W. Botha. And then there was a famous Springbok case, which I think everybody has seen, the film with Matt Damon, Invictus. The game of cricket was identified with the British, the game of soccer with the Black Africans. Afrikaners played rugby. South Africa was going to host the Rugby World Cup tournament in 1995. He brought all the communities on one platform as he reached out to the captain of the rugby team, Francois Pienaar, played by Matt Damon in the film, of the rugby team Springboks, and said, you will play this match provided you have one black on your team. Today, it's led by Black Africans. In the final match, South Africa won over New Zealand. And it made history because Mandela, dressed in the colors of South Africa on his T-shirt, shook the hands of Francois Pienaar, an Afrikaner. And the crowds erupted in joy. Black Africans who didn't like rugby because he was identified with the oppressor learned to embrace rugby. He handed the cup to Pienaar and the handshake became famous. The rugby team sang the national anthem. The white singer P.J. Powers wrote lyrics that resounded with the official slogan. It'll be of interest to understand what this official slogan was. One mind, one heart, every creed, every culture. Every color, Once joined, never apart. Today, you see a rugby team which is winning various accolades. He has realized a secret which very few statesmen realized, and I think only Nehru realized it. A country cannot be formed on the dry bones of law. It has to be founded on generosity and sympathy for your fellow citizens. It has to be founded on what we can call solidarity, if we don't call it fraternity. What I want to do in the last part of the presentation is to talk about 3 speeches he made, which went down in history as models of reconciliation, as models of sane, cool, generous politics. In the first speech he gave, when he came out of prison, he committed each individual will have equal vote, universal adult franchise, irrespective of race, of class, of color, of creed. His second major speech, and this was very interesting, was after the assassination of Chris Hani, the famous communist, who was so popular across the board. He was poised to be the successor of Mandela. He was murdered on 10th April 1993 in Boksburg near Johannesburg. He was shot at point blank range in front of his 15-year-old daughter. The killing was carried out at the behest of a conservative MP who wanted to derail their negotiations, I beg your pardon. MP Clive Derby-Lewis, in that amnesty application to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up later, both the killer, Wallace, and Clive Derby-Lewis admitted they had hoped to wreck the negotiations for the new constitutions. The negotiations had paused for Easter. The murder was committed then. The assassination sparked off a wave of hatred, protest, arson, and violence. Hani was very popular as a leader of the South African Communist Party. He was trusted as a man who would keep the Black radicals under control during the period of transition, and he did not believe in violence. The ANC cadres tried to restore peace and calm. This was the point when Mandela comes onto the television. And you have to understand the genius. I called it the genius of Nelson Mandela. After paying respect to Hani's parents, he went to Johannesburg on the very day the assassin was arrested. Hani's white neighbor, Rita Harmsay, had identified the assassin and testified against him. Before Hani was buried, the white MP, Clive Derby-Lewis, was arrested. Mandela realized that he had to calm passions, he had to assuage the anger of the people. People across communities were submerged in grief. Condolences poured in from all sections of society. And he said, "Today I'm reaching out to every single South African, black and white, from the very depths of my being. A white man full of prejudice and hate came to our country and committed a deal so foul that our whole nation teeters on the brink of disaster. A white woman of Afrikaner origin risked her life so that we may know and bring to justice this assassin." He skillfully drew attention to the complexities of the case. People are not defined by their color. People are defined by their beliefs, by their convictions, by their ideologies. A white man killed a black man, and a white woman brought the assassin to justice. If the former act was racial, the latter act was definitely was in the service of justice. It transcended racial bitterness and animosity. All people were united by grief, and it was this common sentiment which led him to hope that South Africa would become one. Now, he said, is the time for all South Africans to stand together against those who from any quarter wish to destroy what Chris Hani gave his life for, the freedom of all. He underlined the proposition, societies are not underlined by law. They're not held up by law. They are held up by solidarity and the ability to grieve together. He suggested more in this speech, that all human beings are flawed. Nobody is exempt. In a way, human beings are not by themselves racist. They are embedded in an ideology which makes them racist. For him, substantive freedom meant liberation from petty vindictiveness and from the belief that the past is so important that it shapes the present. It holds a message, I think, for all of us. The past cannot be so important that it shapes the present. We cannot be captives to history. We must learn from history, but we cannot be captives to it. The human condition is fallible, it's imperfect, and people are not solely responsible for what they do. It is the ideology they are born into. That is why the wrongdoer is entitled to forgiveness. And that is where he brought in forgiveness. The only route to reconciliation and peace is forgiveness. You must forgive because you realize you are as flawed as the other human being. Mandela refused to be sucked into the vortex of violence, of revenge that marked many regimes of the post-colonial world. Conflict can only reproduce conflict, can violence, sometimes oppression, sometimes as resistance, sometimes violence will simmer beneath the surface, and at others, it will erupt into acts of indescribable brutality. His speech was seen as masterly because it tapped the right emotions in the listeners, and because he asked people to move behind their pain, beyond their pain and courage, to fight for the principles that Anil stood for. The main contradiction was not between races. The main contradiction was between those who believed in violence and those who did not believe in violence, who wanted peace. Divisions between people are not based on color, they're based on belief. He turned the political discourse of racism upside down because that was what he said. Men are essentially good. In the same breath, he highlighted the deed of the assassin and the bravery of the woman who identified the assassin. Evil and redress come from the same source. He called for every institution to commemorate Hani's life. Compassion for avoidable deaths is as important as an emotion that binds us together as our Constitution is. This is the foundation of solidarity, of civic citizenship and peace. That was the day Mandela became accepted as the indisputed leader of a multiracial community. That was the day South Africa set itself on the path of healing and dedicated itself to the values of their heroes. This is not to say that he solved all problems. Young radicals continue to torch cars and burn shops and riot. His speech did not cool every passion, but it is generally agreed that it reduced the incidence of violence. Finally, the landmark speech was when the ANC won the first of all race elections. For the first time, women voted. Women in their 80s, in their 90s voted. And they stood in long queues to vote on 27th April 1994. The election, wrote Mandela, was of a nation reborn, with people for the first time casting their vote and standing in long lines to do so. He was happy ANC got 62.6% of the vote, but he was happy ANC did not get more. He said if ANC had got more, we would have got an ANC constitution. Now we will have a South African constitution because there are other parties represented in parliament as well. That night at the victories celebrations, Mandela said, "Free at last. I stand before you humbled by your courage with a heart full of love for all of you. I regard it as the greatest honor to lead the ANC at this moment of history. I am your servant. It is not the individual that matters, it is the collective. It is time to heal old wounds and build a new South Africa." There was a brief time when Mandela flirted with violence, organized a military arm of the ANC, but the problem was that South Africans internalized violence, and it was this that he set out to destroy. Because the specter of violence hangs heavily upon the heads of society, reiterates moments of pain and sorrow, and breeds frustration and anger. Violence is sterile. Nothing can come out of violence. The benefits are poor and the costs are very high. Those who become rulers have blood on their hands. And like Lady Macbeth, they got, "What will blood never leave my palm?" I'm misphrasing Shakespeare. Blood doesn't wash away very easily. Will these hands never be clean? That was what he wanted to guard against. And this is the genius of Nelson Mandela. Thank you.
Professor Chadwick lecture deserves a standing ovation. Ladies and gentlemen, join me as we give a standing ovation for his deep understanding of and knowledge of Madiba's personality. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. What stand out in this lecture for me as a South African was the creation of Government of National Unity in 1994 to accommodate all the people, including those that have oppressed the Black people. And amongst the legacies that we are taking forward as the government of the Republic of South Africa, we have just created our own national unity after these elections. Instead of going for the coalition government, we said, let's everybody come together and we rule this country, we move forward. Thank you very much, Professor, for that dip. I don't have anything to add or to deduct from your lecture. I think audience should go and read your book to understand better what you have just articulated. Thank you very much. Now, time to introduce one of our illustrious speakers who will do the closing remarks. And I must be very careful here what I'm going to say. As Professor Borker has already alluded that he might join us time soon. Ambassador Anil Sooklal is a scholar, cum diplomat, with a very illustrious career. Amongst his academic credentials, he has 2 PhDs, one in religious studies and another one on Oriental history from the KwaZulu-Natal University in South Africa. Really, to me, this is a good example of what a child of indentured labor or a domestic worker like me can achieve when the grounds are leveled. He was a chief director of North Africa, director of United Nations Political and Global Security Affairs, and head of Department of Parliamentary Office in Cape Town. And there was a coordinator of the substance team of the UN World Conference Against Racism in 2001. Much relevant to us here in India, he was a counselor political at the South African Permanent Mission to the UN and Geneva and at the South African High Commission in New Delhi, respectively. A Deputy Director General responsible for Asia and Middle East in our department until 31 January 2022. He was also an ambassador at large, Asia and BRICS, in the same department from 2022 to 2024. A coordinator for Forum of China and African Cooperation, FOCAC, 2016 to 2019. South Africa's G20 Sherpa, 2012 and 2018. India, Brazil, South Africa, IPSA, Sherpa, 2003 to 2006. And repeated again from 2012 to 2024. He was also a Sherpa of BRICS, 2012 and 2015. And he repeated again from 2016 to 2024 as a Sherpa of BRICS. If I can read his whole biography, we will leave this place tomorrow. I'm sure Professor Borker must have sent you the biography. So you'll go and read it for yourself. In terms of his political history, he's a member of the African National Congress, which is a ruling party in South Africa. Of course, Professor Sooklal was involved in South African liberation struggle. So at this point, I'll give him the floor to do the closing remarks. Over to you, Professor Sooklal.
Thank you, Mr. Mamabolo. Firstly, let me acknowledge Professor Neera Chandoka, Dr. Suhas Borker, my good friend, Mr. Cedric Crowley, our charge d'affaires at the moment, all of the distinguished guests, excellencies, students. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the 7th Annual Mandela Day Lecture. I would like to express my deep gratitude to the India International Center, the South African High Commission, and the Working Group on Alternative Strategies for organizing this lecture. I must express my deep appreciation to Prof. Neera Chandoka for an excellent lecture. She took us through a journey reflecting on Madiba's life that was insightful, enlightening, uplifting, and indeed inspirational. And in many senses, you have reminded us here in South Africa of our own historical past and how fortunate we have been to have had a leader such as Madiba. I also like to express our gratitude for continuing this tradition to celebrate Mandela Day so that we get an opportunity to reflect on the life of this great statesman who sacrificed his life for the betterment of all of humanity. I was very fortunate to have met Mandela prior to joining government on many occasions, and also when I became a civil servant. And what struck me about Nelson Mandela was firstly, he was very humane. He always reminded us he's a normal human being, but we know that he was an extraordinary person. He was full of humility. He made everyone feel important. No matter what your station in life, he elevated you the moment you met him. He was someone that was inclusive, and I think Dr. Chandoka brought this point out very clearly. He provided leadership. He was, in many senses, not just a leader of South Africa, the African continent, but a global figure. But importantly, I think one of the high water marks of Nelson Mandela's personality was his spirit of forgiveness. That's a very rare human condition that even is difficult to find in today's society. And it was this spirit of forgiveness that led him to speak of reconciliation and united all South Africans, despite our painful past and the divisions that separated us into different communities, races, and groups. But he became a unifying figure. And again, Dr. Chandoka demonstrated this through various of his actions. And he even used sport, as was pointed out. He used sport to weld South African society together and overcome the prejudices and differences that existed in our mind, born out of the experiences of apartheid. And this was a person who, to use an Indian term, was a true karma yogi. He was a selfless servant of all of society. He gave of himself to all of humanity and worked for the betterment, not just of his own country and his own people, but society at large. What is the relevance of this event and why do we celebrate it? Nelson Mandela, his life, he was one of the major giants of the last century, together with Martin Luther King and Gandhiji. These were extraordinary human beings, and we were very fortunate that we had such leaders in our midst at a time when we needed them most. But perhaps we need to reflect on the life of Mandela today, because the values and principles that Mandela stood for and lived by are needed today far more than ever before. We live in a highly stratified world, a highly polarized world, a fractured world, divided into various camps, plagued with violence, with war, and divisions between nations, societies, and communities is widening rather than narrowing. And these are the very issues that Nelson Mandela fought against to create an inclusive, peaceful global society. And yet we find ourselves moving further and further away from the very principles that he lived by and for which he sacrificed his life. He worked for the upliftment of the downtrodden, the poor, and the so-called outcast and marginalized in society. And yet today we live in a world where war is the norm of the day. Thousands are killed each day and we don't blink an eye. We've become immune to human suffering. And yet he suffered because we could be free today. The freedom that we enjoy in South Africa today is precisely because of Mandela and his generation of leadership that sacrificed so that we could have a better life. But are we doing justice to Mandela's legacy, to his life, to his sacrifice, and all those heroes of our freedom struggle, the freedom struggle of India, and many other nations that came out of colonialism, imperialism, and injustice? I think we need to pause as we celebrate this day to reflect on the challenges confronting all of us and how we as a human society are not doing enough to ensure that we build a global community that is inclusive, where no one is left behind, where no one is marginalized, but every human life, as Mandela himself pointed out, is equally valued and equally sacred. So I think as we continue to reflect on the life of Mandela and celebrate his life and recall his life, it's important for us to also reflect and pause for a moment on what is going on around us in our respective countries, especially the plight of those that are in poverty, that those that have pain and suffering in their midst, those that are unemployed, and those that are suffering as a result of violence, as a result of conflict, as a result of civil strife that we have that continues to plague human society today. I believe that in reflecting through the 7th Nelson Mandela Lecture, we have an opportunity to create a compact amongst ourselves and to let this compact radiate into larger society, that we all have a responsibility to take the values, teachings, and lessons espoused in Mandela's life, espoused in Gandhiji's life, espoused in Martin Luther King's life, amongst many others that have given to human society. We owe it to work towards healing the rifts that exist in our communities, in our families, in our societies, and the larger world. I think Mandela's life is a stark reminder. He was a torch during the dark days of apartheid in South Africa that brought light to South Africa and lifted the gloom of apartheid so that we all could enjoy the sunshine that he radiated upon our lives. I want to express my deep appreciation to all of you to create this opportunity, because it gives us an opportunity to reflect. And as we leave this lecture, I think we all have a responsibility to see how, in whatever little way we can, to contribute towards alleviating the pain and suffering of our fellow human beings, and not just human life, but all of life, our environment, the devastation and destruction that we bring about to our environment by neglecting it, through various wars and various other ways that we don't give the respect to this sacred earth that we have, which Mandela also spoke about. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important occasion and for us to continue to celebrate a life that was sacrificed so that we all could move forward based on what he gave to all of us. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Ambassador Sooklal, thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our lecture. So we are looking forward to your participation in the 8th edition next year. Thank you very much indeed.